Ocular by Iniquity. Chapter 8. He opened his eyes, but darkness still surrounded him. Darkness and warmth, and the sensation of being held. Surely he was dead. He was dead, and this was heaven, and it was his mother wrapped around him, and she would sing him the songs she used to sing at night. They would be happy. The cold and the pain and the hunger and the hopelessness and the death would all be gone. He would no longer have to fight every moment of every day. He would be remembered as a noble and valiant soldier. He closed his eyes and pulled closer to the warmth. The air was stuffy and hot, and it was hard to breathe, but he could do nothing. His body did not listen to his commands. His body wanted to shut down. It wouldn't take that much to do so, only a decision against another gulp of thick air. He thought about every breath. His mind was fuzzy and dull and expecting the sound of his mother's laughter. He would go down the street to the store and see if he could beg some more food for them. He would collect anything that looked like it could be sold. If he was lucky, there would be time for reading after chores. His mother's hand stroked his back. He smiled lazily, thinking of her. "Mother," he said, but he could barely hear his own voice. It was the voice of a ghost. "Do you need for anything?" The hand on his back stopped. It moved to his shoulder and traveled down his arm. It found his face and tilted his head up. His mother's face began to take shape in the darkness. It was not easy for a spirit to see, but he could manage with some effort. Her face was odd. He had remembered it being rounder and more cheery, with fewer lines, and "Alexander," a voice said in a trembling whisper. The hand stroked his cheek. The fingers shook. You're not my mother."
"No."
"Who are you?" The voice made a strangled noise.
I'm your Lawrence."
His Lawrence. He knew his Lawrence. It was not his mother, no, and there was no replacement for her. But if he had to be accompanied by anyone, and it could not be her, his Lawrence was the definite next selection. His Lawrence completed him in a way that no other creature did. Perhaps they had been born two halves of a whole, destined only for destiny to bring them together, so they could conquer this misery. His Lawrence was the sun in his sky, the clear water of his river, the wildflowers of his meadow. "That's good," Alexander said, and leaned into the touch of those rough fingers against the stubble of his cheek. His Lawrence touched him in a manner that no other man could. "I like my Lawrence." His Lawrence managed a small smile. Alexander could see the white of teeth in the darkness suddenly appear, then retreat. He wanted to see his Lawrence smile more.
"I like you too, Hamilton."
"You're Hamilton," he said as a correction. Such a thing only made sense after all. It was not so much a question, as it was quite clear to him he had been Lawrence's Hamilton for some time. As it was stating the obvious. It was his duty to correct his Lawrence when he misspoke. It would be poor form to allow his Lawrence to be incorrect. He belonged to his Lawrence as much as his Lawrence belonged to him.
"Yes,"
his Lawrence said, his whisper shaking.
"Of course. My Hamilton."
The hand moved from his face to brush across the top of his hair with infinite kindness. The care of it penetrated the beyond and reminded him of being solid. He could not imagine a life without that touch. To be deprived of it for the rest of eternity seemed like a hellish future. But he knew that to keep it he would have to remain here. He could not move on and feel the pads of those fingers. It was a convincing argument to stay. He glared back at the freezing, starving army. He looked forward to his mother. He looked back towards his Lawrence. The dark seemed less dark with his Lawrence here. The cold seemed less cold. He could see the color of his Lawrence vest contrasting with the dirty white of his undershirt. His Lawrence wasn't wearing his cravat, and it was easy for his eyes to focus on the exposed flesh at his throat. "My Lawrence." He liked saying it. It sounded good. Natural. Of course, this was his Lawrence. His Lawrence wrapped around him in this place that seemed so quiet and dark and hot that it could not be real. His Lawrence's voice so near that all they needed was the faintest of whispers. His Lawrence arms surrounding him. He liked being this close, so that he could see the freckles that dotted the other man's skin. He could study them. They shook. His Lawrence was shaking. He frowned. "What upsets you so, my lord?" he asked. Every time he said it, it sounded better. That his Lawrence was upset was an unacceptable turn of events. In this place so far away from anyone or anything else, sealed off from the misery of what had been his past life on the other side of the storm. There was no excuse for his Lawrence to be distraught. It was his responsibility to change such a thing, if only his body would listen to him. Perhaps he no longer had a body. He would have to learn a new way to change the world without one. That would be next, after he had improved his Lawrence's mood. His Lawrence's voice was thick and contained a hesitancy Alexander was not familiar with. His Lawrence must have been greatly ill. He would need care.
I plead that you ignore the indignity of such an action, but I must beg you not to die. My Alexander, to imagine this war without you by my side is to imagine how on earth I would be half a man were I forced to speak at your funeral.
"I could not do something that would upset you so deeply," Alexander said. It seemed patently absurd to engage in any action that would upset his Lawrence any further than he was now, especially considering the great lengths his Lawrence had gone to comfort him. After all, the man had come into this strange half-space to comfort him. He could not very well leave him here. Even further, dying seemed so severe. He could imagine the great offense he might do to his Lawrence and possibly many others by engaging in such a senseless act. It did not matter that he was so tired, or that he felt so worn all over. That nothing in his body seemed to truly work was irrelevant. These things came much lower in importance than not upsetting his Lawrence.
Will you promise me that you will not die?
"I would promise you the world, had I it to give." He would touch his Lawrence. He would reach from his half-death and back into his body, for that seemed so much easier than learning to move as a ghost. He needed his hands to touch the other half of his soul. He could not do without them. He focused on where his hand would be, and felt it all of a sudden. It did not feel pleasant. It felt like a cold, stinging weight attached to his warm spirit. It didn't matter. The cold had to be suffered to comfort his Lawrence. The pain had to be bared, because without that pain, how would he know how his Lawrence felt? He felt hard for his arm, which appeared at his shoulder equally as suddenly. The arm felt worse, like a long, jagged icicle, frozen and sharp. His body seemed so unpleasant and terrible in comparison to the warm nothingness, but it could not be helped. He would need this thing to comfort his Lawrence, as terrible as it seemed in so many ways. He reached, slower than he would have expected, for the 5 freckles at his Lawrence's throat. They were beautiful. He touched the skin there. Where he touched his Lawrence, the man was warm and slick from sweat in their dark half-life. Where he touched his Lawrence, the man's life flowed into him. Alexander felt more solid, and his limbs seemed closer. Not so much like a musket or pen, more him than a tool. His Lawrence was sweaty and dirty, but they all were, and somehow this did not stop Alexander from being in awe of the feel of his skin. He tried to remember the last time he had touched his Lawrence, although it seemed like there had been nothing in his life besides this dark cocoon. All around his thoughts were storms. The past was a hurricane. The future was hailstones. His Lawrence tipped a finger under his chin and tilted his head up until they were making eye contact. Alexander's face suddenly seemed real to him. It was not a mask. He could not discard it so easily to take the next step, not with his Lawrence having touched it. He had eyes, a nose, a mouth. It seemed he had flesh again, and that flesh knitted itself all around his spirit. It was a prison. It was a prison he would have to bear, for he could not escape without his Lawrence. Life seemed so cold and horrible, but he could not abandon it with his Lawrence still there.
Promise me, Alexander,
his Lawrence said. "I promise to not die, my Lawrence," he said dutifully. He could not disobey or ignore such a request from his Lawrence. It was simply not possible. His Lawrence brought both their hands to his face. Alexander felt the unshaven, warm skin on the other man's cheek. The plane of the other man's flesh was like a step back into his body. The feel of it surged from his hand and down his arm into his chest. He felt his heart beat. He felt his lungs expand. Dead men did not breathe. Breathing could not be so much of a struggle if your body was not your own. If he would have been shackled to this ragged, worn thing, he would use it for his benefit. He thought of a command to his hand, and it listened. His finger moved from one freckle on his Lawrence's cheek to the next. Most of the man's freckles were in a scattered cluster, where it was easy to trace them all. The freckles climbed up his nose and down the other side. He drew his finger down the line of Lawrence's nose and smiled.
How do you feel, my Hamilton?
Lawrence asked. Alexander could feel the warmth of his breath on his skin.
I feel tired,
he answered. That was certainly the strongest feeling. It felt as if it would be so easy then to step away from this beaten form, to be a spirit again, to be nothing, to close his eyes and escape hunger and suffering. But it could not be so if he touched his Lawrence. To touch his Lawrence was to acknowledge that he was alive and that there was reason to be so. What kept him awake and in this moment was the feel of his Lawrence skin under his fingers and the man's hand resting on his arm. When Lawrence spoke, every word was like a tiny weight, grounding him to this reality, sealing him more firmly into his body.
I would like to sleep. My mother will be there.
He knew a strange certainty that his mother waited. She was close to him, just on the other side of consciousness. If he were to let go of his body, he could see her. She waited in her endless patience behind his eyelids. Part of him, most of him, ached to see her, begged and cried out that this weight holding him down was no longer required. He could feel better, the pain would be gone, the cold would be gone, the hunger would be gone. His Lawrence's hand shook as the man stroked his arm. Every caress made him feel a little more solid. His mother stepped away when Lawrence shifted closer until he could feel the heat of the man's skin bleeding off his chest. He had no space other than to rest his face in his Lawrence's neck until his skin and those dark freckles were all he could see. He watched his Lawrence move ever so slightly with every breath. He realized he had never seen something so wonderful.
I would much prefer you stay with me, my Alexander. What would you like to do?
He could not very well turn down the opportunity to spend time with his Lawrence. His mother would have to wait. She had become good at waiting, he imagined. It had been a long time since she had seen him. He thought about things to do.
Tell me about yourself,
he said, because he could not imagine something better than lying in his Lawrence's arms, listening to the man talk about himself. His Lawrence's voice could banish his misery. His Lawrence speaking would be a reason to be awake, to be present, to be alive.
About what?
Anything. He thought that he would kiss his Lawrence. How could one not kiss something of such grace and majesty? How could one not want to be so close and so intimate with something so wonderful? How could one not desire this closeness with the man who made the other half of his soul? If he was to stay for his Lawrence, he would need to know more about the man. He already knew the man's spirit. He would need to know the flesh. He kissed his Lawrence's throat. He could not explain the sensation of it. He could not express in mere words how it felt to press his lips to his man's skin. This sense could only be felt. It felt like a surge of warmth in his skin. He had skin. It felt like heat in his blood. He had blood. He had a body.
Hamilton,
his Lawrence said from above him.
Your Hamilton,
he corrected.
Yes, my Hamilton.
His Lawrence twisted to make eye contact again, and Alexander drew his eyes up to his Lawrence's face. He could manage this, looking at his Lawrence. He could look at his Lawrence for eternity. He would accept the cold and the pain and the misery, all, if he was able to look at his Lawrence.
Did you just kiss me?
His Lawrence asked.
Yes, my Lawrence,
Hamilton answered, because it was the truth.
And I would do so again.
He would do more than kiss his Lawrence. He would want to know every inch of him.
Oh, my Alexander.
His Lawrence managed to chuckle. It was strange. Something about his Lawrence voice was off, and he could not identify what it was. Was his Lawrence upset that Alexander had kissed him? It was not possible. His Lawrence made him whole. His Lawrence could not deny the sense between them that Alexander could not explain. His Lawrence must have felt it as surely as he did. His Lawrence could not deny such a thing. Will you kiss me, my Lawrence? His Lawrence pressed a gentle kiss to his lips. His Lawrence was warm and solid and so completely steady that it seemed absurd he would leave. He could feel his fingers and his toes and the whole sense of his body. There was no one else for him. The storm was a cheery sun shower that he delighted in. The snowfall was beautiful and filled with soft flakes. He dared it to come closer by closing his eyes. His mother was so far from him that he did not even see her in the darkness behind his eyelids. She could not see someone as alive as Alexander was. He could not see someone who had already passed, not when he was so solid.
Was that to your standards, my Hamilton?
Lawrence asked, his voice gentle. Yes, Alexander answered, and for a long second he savored the warmth that radiated from his lips and through his bones. He had bones. He had sinews and tissue and muscle. It was all there and was bound to it as surely as strings on a harp. Now, he said, I want to know all about you. His Lawrence began to speak. He started at the beginning. He had been born in South Carolina. There had been his mother and his father. He had 2 brothers. His mother had died, and he had gone to study in London and then Geneva. There he had learned. Alexander resettled himself back in the crook of his Lawrence's neck. He stared at those freckles until he could no longer keep his eyes open. And for longer after that, he let the sound of his Lawrence voice surround him and sink into him so deeply that he could not have been more thoroughly chained to this life.